Hello, and welcome to a brand new day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. We're finally here. We've come all the way to Multicolor for murders at Karlov Manor. The reason I leave Multicolor for last is because the color requirements of the cards are the most stringent, the most difficult to meet for deck building construction. That being said, multicolor cards are often some of the strongest, so let's dive in here. I already covered the Pride of the Hulklade in green. Whoops. I should have counted it as a multicolor card, but let us skip it here for now. No more lies. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. Well, that's like a mana leak. That's pretty strong. If that spell's countered this way, exile it. Also, quite strong. Yeah, if you're in these colors, I think you probably do run some number of this card, unless you're an aggro deck and you're going with Thalia, in which case I might not run this spell even if you are in the colors. Otherwise, yeah, this is great. Officious Interrogation. So this one, in a two-player game, you can either target it on one player or target it on both players. And then you investigate X times, where X is the total number of creatures those players control. So if you are in the color combination, this spell is actually better than an artifact that I like to run. I'm talking about Investigator's Journal here. So this one gains suspect counters equal to the greatest number of creatures that a player controls, not both players. This thing can gain a ton of counters and draw you a ton of cards. It's also pretty reasonable just to play it out when there's one creature on the board and have it draw you 2 cards, because it can only sacrifice itself to draw a card. But this thing will get you individual clue tokens for all the creatures that both players have if you multi-kicker it or whatever. And that means that it's not as vulnerable to targeted artifact removal, because they can only blow up one of your mini clue tokens. So if you're in this color combination, this could give you staying power into a long, long game. The only question is whether you need that much staying power, or whether a spell that draws you less total cards but was more mana efficient was a better include for your deck. And for that, I think you just have to experiment. I do believe this card can draw you more total cards than other things, but it costs more mana to do so. So, I don't know. It could be good enough. It could also give you a heck of a bunch of triggers for an artifact deck. Alquist Proft, Master Sleuth. This guy's just fine. He's a 3/3 Vigilance that gives you a clue. And that is perfectly serviceable. So, if you're in like a Raffine deck or whatever, you've got like a Legends deck kicking in Obscura colors, then Alquist Proft could be like a one-of include and easily be good enough for a deck like that. He's already replaced himself with a clue. Or if you get him in the late game and you can wait until you untap, then he could draw you a lot more cards using his activated ability. Yeah, I don't think he's amazing. I don't think there's any wow factor here, but I think he's a very serviceable, reasonable card. Private Eye. Oh, this set is so campy. Okay. Other detectives you control get +1/+1. It's a 3/3 for 3. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, target detective can't be blocked this turn. If the detective deck was good enough for standard, I'm sure you would probably be running this guy. He pumps up the squad. He's a 3/3 on his own, which is fine. Um, and as long as you're drawing some cards, then your detectives can't be blocked. That's good too. Do you see that flavor text up there? Floating above Private Eye? Yep, it's a vase, alright. That is so campy. Why did they do that? Okay, so these cards I'm actually not going to cover again in Multicolor, because I've been over these cards for every monocolored section, because you can technically play them in monocolor. I think there's one for every 2-color pair. None of them are really good enough to see standard play. Some of them are close, the ones that produce like token creatures and stuff, but none of them really are good enough to see standard play, and I've covered them to death. So I'm going to skip these. Ezram Agency Chief. We got a 5/5 flyer for 5, but he's really for 6 mana because of his activated ability. So that's flying. The ETBs you investigate twice. Alright, so useful. You can pay 1, sack an artifact, which doesn't have to be one of those clues. It could be some other artifact. And Ezram gains your choice of Vigilance, Lifelink, or Hexproof until end of turn. Unless you have like 2 or 3 copies of this guy in your hand, and you desperately need a board presence, I don't think you just slam him on 5. I think you wait until you have 6 mana so you can make him hexproof, so he's protected as soon as you play the card. But, you know, like I said, if you got multiple copies in hand, just, you know, play to the board, do what you gotta do. As to whether this is good enough to see standard play or not, I would say the jury is out. Meticulous Archive. I already looked at these in the land section. In Colorless and Lands was the first video I put out. Soul Search. We got a 2-mana sorcery. Opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, exile it. It is powerful that it exiles. That's useful. If its mana value happened to be 1 or less, then you get a 1/1 white and black spirit token with flying. Most of the time this is going to be Pilfer. A card that we already had in Standard. Now this one exiles the card, which is more powerful than Pilfer. And it should be. It costs, you know, white mana in addition to black. Once in a rare while, it's going to give you a little flying token. Is this good enough for standard play? Some people play Pilfer. Yeah, I don't know if Pilfer is really good enough, but some people do run it. So if Pilfer was a card you were thinking about running and you're in these colors, then yeah, you could play Soul Search. I don't think it's that powerful, but it's fine. Skip. Teysa, Opulent Oligarch. We got a 2/3 Death Toucher for 3. Not bad. Death Touch does a lot for you. At the beginning of your in-step, investigate for each opponent who lost life this turn. That could be damage, right? Like combat damage. It could be other things too. Whenever a clue you control is put in a graveyard from the battlefield, you get a 1/1 white and black spirit token with flying. This ability triggers only once each turn. So, if you want to get the flyers from Teysa, you want to pace yourself to where you're sacking a clue on the opponent's turn and on your turn. That would be mana intensive. You could put her in like a Mardu deck that's like Rakdos Anvil. And then you would have outlets for more cheaply sacrificing the clues. There are ways to use Teysa for sure. I don't think she's that powerful, but I think she's not useless either. If the things that she's doing are things you're interested in building a deck for, and they're kind of two different deck ideas a little bit, although the Rakdos Anvil does turn on the life loss part of the card too. So that's not bad. Then, yeah, There's probably a variety of ways to try to build a Teysa deck. So, if she interests you, I think there are different paths you could follow. Tomik, Wielder of Law. 2/4 Flying Vigilance, affinity for Planeswalkers. That only can reduce the cost by 1. You can't get it below a white and a black. That's a really weird line of text. They should either just delete that line of text or make this a 2-mana card. Affinity for Planeswalkers. That did not need to be here. If I can just get on my soapbox for a second, that feels like lousy card design to me. That's just making the card more complicated, taking up headspace that didn't need to be there. The only possible way it can be of use is to reduce the mana cost by 1 mana, and only if you have Planeswalkers. And it's not that expensive of a card to start with. Why this card? Anyway, whenever an opponent attacks with creatures, if 2 or more of those creatures are attacking you, and or Planeswalkers you control, that opponent loses 3 life and you draw a card. This is pretty good against go-wide strategies, and the stat line of a 2/4 Flying Vigilance is not that embarrassing. So, depending on the meta, depending on how much aggro you think you're going to be fighting, yeah, this is a heck of a stop sign against an aggro deck. It would be even nastier if it gained you life, but you know, you do get to counter race, you get to peck over in the air, vigilance, they lose life when they attack with 2 or more things. Now, this card doesn't do much against a player who's not aggro, so it feels more like a sideboard card for best of 3, but the stat line's about good enough you could run it, you know, main deck. It's not amazing, but in the matchups where you're punishing the opponent, it's going to be really nice. Treacherous Greed, this is the opposite of a toolbox card. This is a narrow build-around rare. So as an additional cost to play this 3-mana instant, sacrifice a creature that dealt damage this turn. Usually you don't want to do this. Not only do you not necessarily want to sack a creature, but you're sacrificing something that was able to hit the opponent, which is maybe one of your more valuable creatures, something more useful. Now, for doing all of this, you do draw 3 cards and drain the opponent for 3. But it's not as great as it sounds because you had to take a piece off of the board and spin this card to draw 3. So you're only +1 card, effectively, from where you started. And draining the opponent for 3 is nice and all, but that's just offsetting some of your tempo loss from sacrificing a creature that was able to deal damage to them. So I really don't recommend crafting this card. Kaya Spirit's Justice. Kaya is powerful, but humor me for a second. I'd like to count how many lines of text she has. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are 10 lines of text on Kaya Spirit's Justice. Oh boy. So we got a 3 loyalty planeswalker for 4. She has this static ability. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control and or creature cards in your graveyard are put into exile. Okay. A creature card in play or in your graveyard is put into exile. Okay, okay. You may choose a creature card from among them. Alright. Pick one. Until end of turn, target token you control becomes a copy of it except it has flying. And that doesn't have to be a creature token. You could turn a clue or a blood token or something into this creature that got exiled. Alright then. So, what are her abilities? +2. You surveil 2, that's nice. Then exile a card from a graveyard. So there's no card advantage that occurs from this, but she could be triggering her ability. As long as you have a token in play, and the thing you exile from the graveyard is a creature, then you could make a token into a copy of the thing you exiled. +1. Create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying. At least this mode's pretty straightforward. It does give you tokens that you're able to make into copies of things. Also, you could just play a game where you just plus her, and she's just a token factory. Keeps giving you flyers, keeps pressuring the opponent that way and protecting herself. And that's fine. That's like a normal Planeswalker kind of way to play the game. -2, exile target creature you control. For each other player, exile up to 1 target creature that player controls. So it's got extra text on it for multiplayer. But basically it means you exile one of yours, you exile one of theirs. And then when that happens, she can trigger her ability. You can't make a copy of the opponent's creature, though. It's just her ability only triggers for your stuff, for making copies of things. Is she good? Probably. She's probably good. I think she's powerful. I feel like there was no reason to be this complicated. I don't like thinking about this card and trying to deck build with this card because this wall of text and all of this stuff about copying things in exile, I don't like it. I think she's probably effective, though. And sure, there's probably multiple ways to build a Kaya deck. So, is she a good tool for the toolbox? Probably, if you can wrap your head around her. So I'd say yeah. Yeah, if you like Kaya and what she's doing here, then you could probably get some mileage out of her. Wisp Drinker Vampire. It's a 2/4 flyer for 4. It's mostly a limited card, but it's a little bit interesting. Whenever another creature with power 2 or less ETBs under your control, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. So, you know, if you're doing something like you're in Mardu colors, you play the red card where you blow up your own artifact and get 3 goblins, she triggers for each one of those goblins. That would be like 3 points of life drain right there. This would be kind of like a budget option way to like drain out the opponent with little creatures and tokens. She also has an activated ability for 7. And if you're thinking about activating this, don't make my mistake. Pay attention to the fact that it only affects things with power 2 or less. So if you've pumped up your creatures, or you have bigger creatures, don't make the mistake of thinking that she's going to affect the whole board. Only your little stuff. The creatures you control with power 2 or less gain Death Touch and Lifelink until end of turn. So I don't think this card's quite good enough for standard, but I think it's close. I think it's like a budget option, where you could kind of build around the ETB trigger of the drains. So, yeah, if you got a small collection or you want to just try out a kind of a budget build, I think you could do some work with this card. It's just a little slow at 4 mana for standard. At least it offsets it with some life gain. Drag the Canal. Blue and a black instant. Create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. If a creature died this turn, you gain 2 life, surveil 2, and investigate. So, as long as a creature died this turn, you're getting pretty good value off of a 2 mana play. You know, you're getting like an instant speed blocker, potentially. And then if you get like the gain 2, surveil 2, investigate, you eventually get a replacement card, you get card selection, you get things in the graveyard. Life gain helps to offset a damage race. The only real question is, what is the deck that wants this card? Are you like kind of a flash deck that's getting out things at flash speed and then like counter racing and pressuring the opponent doing a tempo game? That would be interesting. Are you control, where you just want like some early turn plays? You're likely to have removal spells that trigger the, creature died clause on the card. You just wait till a little bit later to play it. That'd be fine too. I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly what deck wants the card, but the card seems okay. I think as long as you're triggering the creature died clause on the card, you're doing good things. Lazav, Wearer of Faces. I had the pleasure of using this card in Limited, and it's a powerhouse. It's already a 2/3 for 2. And it was not long ago in Standard that people were playing 2/3s for 2. Dinnick still sees some play in the format. He has lifelink. That's even better for Rafine, of course. But it wasn't that long ago that Ludovic Necrogenius actually was seeing some play in some lists of legends and, in the Obscura colors. Some people call that Esper. Yeah, Ludovic was seeing play. Let's, could get into some early game scraps against aggressive creatures. Had some, long game potential to give you some interesting value down the road. People were running this card. It was not that long ago. Lazav is far more powerful. So the moment that Lazav attacks, you exile a card from a graveyard, so he hates on the graveyard, and you investigate. So every attack trigger, he investigates, makes a clue. And then you have the clue right there before the opponent has the opportunity to block. You can sacrifice the clue, make him a copy of a creature that he has exiled. That could give him flying, give him menace, make him too big for them to effectively block. Lazav is actually quite dangerous, quite powerful. It's not quite as powerful as saying, draw a card when he attacks, but it's not far off. He's really good, especially for coming down on 2. Etrata, Deadly Fugitive. This is a neat card. So we have a 1/4 Death Toucher for 3. That is a good blocker. Face down creatures you control have 2 blue-black. Turn this creature face up. If you can't, because maybe it was a cloaked card, and it wasn't actually a creature, you exile it, then you may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost. As long as you didn't cloak a land, then an instant, a sorcery, a planeswalker, a battle, you can play it without paying its mana cost. So she gives it this ability to flip up and cast for 4 at instant speed. So as long as you can cloak the cards, Etrata can give you a flash and a mana reduction potentially on whatever it is you're doing. And also, whenever an assassin you control deals combat damage to an opponent, you cloak the top card of that player's library. So she's got a synergy with herself. And if you had other assassins in the deck, that could be useful too. Etrata's pretty neat. I think she's good enough to potentially play on her own. The opponent doesn't want to block her because of Death Touch, but they do want to block her because they don't want you cloaking the cards off their library. So it's a rough choice on whether to block Etrata. And you could also try her in a synergy deck with cloaking. If you're able to cloak cards in some other way, then you could be making some ridiculous plays at instant speed. You know, getting out Portal to Phyrexia and other silly stuff. By using Etrata. As long as you can cloak the cards somehow. Skip. Curious Cadaver. 3-power flyer. Could make some trades for you. Don't know how likely it is to be able to get in Standard. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, you return this from your graveyard to your hand. If it reanimated straight to the battlefield, people would probably be looking at it for constructed. Just regrowing to your hand, though. It's interesting, but I don't know if it gets there. It's a little mana intensive to use in Standard in that way. It's just an uncommon, though, so if you want to experiment. Coerced to Kill. This card is much better than it looks. Most people see a 5-mana card. It's easy to be unimpressed with a 5-mana card. But this one steals the opponent's best creature. Now it shrinks down to a 1/1, but it does gain Death Touch. So you're already up a card when you play this, right? You've shrunk the opponent's board, you've grown your own board, so you've had a board impact. And you're neutral on cards because you played this and you got a board presence. If the opponent has to, you know, trade with this in combat, or use a removal spell on it, then you're up another card. I think this could be Standard playable. I know it looks expensive and clunky, but it's just a really impactful board swing. Gleaming Geardrake. We have a 1/1 flyer for a blue and a red. When it ETBs, you investigate. And whenever you sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on Gleaming Geardrake. Pretty neat. I think this could be good enough to see Standard play. I don't think it goes in a wide variety of decks, though. I could be wrong about that. Maybe you could, you know, add green and do like a Jeskai Colors deck with the Teething Wormlet. Maybe you could go into black and do like a Rakdos Anvil build. But obviously you need artifact synergy and you need to be sacking them. It's solid. If you like building this kind of deck, then it's just an uncommon. I think it could maybe get there. Kylex's Volt Strider. We got a weird one. This is a 3-mana vehicle. It is a 4/4 vehicle. It crews for 2. That's reasonable. You can collect evidence 6 whenever you want, and it becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. So that doesn't cost any mana, just whenever you got stuff in your graveyard, you can exile it and animate this thing. It's kind of interesting. And whenever this attacks, you can cast an instant or sorcery spell from among cards exiled with it. So you actually want to do the collect evidence to use its ability. If that spell would be put into a graveyard, put it on the bottom of its owner's library instead. What this card does not say is that you can cast it without paying its mana cost. You still have to pay its mana cost. And then once you've used it, it goes to the bottom of your library. So there's no discount on mana here. All you are getting is card advantage, basically. You're able to use those spells again. So no discount on mana. You do get card advantage. You get a 4/4 for 3, potentially. Is that good enough? I have no idea. I'm not exactly sure what you do with this card and how you use it. If anyone remembers Demi-Lich, it was an interesting card that didn't quite get there in Constructed. I did try to make a Demi-Lich deck at one point, and it was somewhat playable in Standard. Back in Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. Demi-Lich had a similar effect to this, where you could cast spells from your graveyard when it attacks. I think this card would probably be okay, but I don't know that it goes in a wide variety of decks. It feels like a build-around. And it's a mythic, so it's a little scary to commit the wild cards. It could be really powerful, but I don't think it's a flexible enough tool to recommend for the toolbox. Detective Satchel. This one's neat. So you get a 4-mana artifact, two, a blue, and a red. When it enters the battlefield, investigate twice, so you get 3 artifacts for 4 mana. You can tap this thing to make a 1/1 Thopter with flying, but you can only do that if you sacrificed an artifact this turn. This feels like another card that's trying to push blue into the Rakdos Anvil deck. Right, so if you got Gleaming Geardrake, and you got Detective Satchel, then in the Anvil deck, this is going to be gaining counters, and this is going to be just tapping to make Thopters for you. And those are both good. This Satchel is especially good with the Anvil. The Anvil loves that this is making more artifact creatures for you. It's also a source of 3 artifacts all on its own for the Anvil to be sacrificing. So, could this be good enough to see Standard play? I'm going to say maybe. I don't know if it goes in a wide variety of decks, but it does produce a lot of material for the board. It also produces card advantage, it's just slow. And it can add to your board while you're cracking those clues by making Thopters. They can pressure the opponent a little or be blocking for you. I don't think it's terrible. As for just being an uncommon, it's not costing you much to try it. Skip. Ill-timed Explosion. So, you can always play this as a 4-mana sorcery to draw 2 cards. Just like to point that out. If you don't need to sweep the board. But you may discard 2 cards, and when you do, it deals X damage to each creature, where X is the greatest mana value among cards discarded this way. It doesn't hit Planeswalkers, but that might be an opportunity for you to be running Planeswalkers. Some of the other red board sweepers do hit Planeswalkers, and that can be awkward if you have your own. This one, you can run your own Planeswalkers safely, right next to it. That might be an opportunity. It's a pretty good board sweeper in Izzet colors. Something we haven't really had. So, I think this card's neat. I think it's entirely playable. Melek, Reforged Researcher. 5 mana. Legendary creature, weird detective. So this cards, power and toughness are each equal to twice the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. So he could be ridiculously large. It also says the first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn costs 3 colorless less to cast. That is a big discount. So I don't think most of the time you can get away with playing a 5-drop in Standard whose only role is to be gigantic. Green has had some cards like that, like Gigantosaurus. That's like a 10/10 for 5 green. I might have had Trample. That card didn't really do anything. So just being big isn't enough here, but I think if you had 6 mana, you play this for 5, and then you have some 4 mana instants or sorceries in your deck that you can reduce down to like 1 blue or 1 red. That feels like it could be a reason to play this card. Is he good enough for Standard? Probably not. It's definitely big enough to kill the opponent, especially if you make him unblockable or give him flying. Just kind of an odd card. I feel like it's not doing as much as it ought to for your Mythic Rare and for 5 mana. Not useless, though. As long as you're able to pop off, you know, a 4 mana spell for 1, then you've gotten pretty good value off of Melek. Kylox, Visionary Inventor. This one is a really difficult deck building puzzle. So you got a 4/4 for 7, has Menace, Ward 2, and Haste. You know, those aren't bad abilities, but it's not enough for being 7 mana, so what else does it do? Whenever this attacks, sacrifice any number of other creatures. Okay, you're shrinking your board. Then exile the top X cards of your library, where X is their total power. Alright. You may cast any number of instant and or sorcery spells from among the exiled cards without paying their mana costs. So this card is asking you to have creatures to get to 7 mana to be able to attack with this thing, and then to have some big instant and sorcery payoffs in your deck that you can get to cast for free. How you manage to cram all of that into a deck, I'm not quite sure. Maybe if you had some instants and sorceries that produce creatures, right? There's the green domain spell that puts out a 3/3 for every type of basic land you control. If that wasn't enough to win the game by itself, which maybe it was, but if it wasn't, then you could come in with Kylox, you know, sacrifice those things, exile the top 15 cards of your library because you got 15 power of tokens, and then cast any instants and sorceries you ran across in those top 15 for free, including more copies of that card to put out more 3/3s. Is that just a win more card at that point? Maybe. I'm not sure. What else? What else? There's an 8/8 for 2. So if you could trick Kylox into play for less than 7 mana, right? You reanimate him from your graveyard or something. Then you sacrifice the 8/8 for 2. Right? That couldn't attack or block anyway, so you might as well sacrifice it. Then you get to look at the top 8. Right? So if you played that on 2, you did some mill into the graveyard, you get Kylox out for like 4 or 5 mana by reanimating him, and then you look at the top 8, and you've got some other spells you could hit. Could be other reanimation spells, could be Breach the Multiverse. Okay, maybe that would work. Maybe. Does this go in a wide variety of decks? I don't think so. This is a build-around. 100% a build-around. And it feels like it's not good enough to build around, but who knows. I don't recommend it. Blood Spatter Analysis. When you really boil down this card, after, parsing its 8 lines of text, it hits an opponent's creature for 3 at sorcery speed for 2 mana, which is fine. And then eventually, you mill some stuff in your graveyard and you get to do a Raise Dead. Return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. That is not a bad package for 2 mana. There's a whole lot of text on the card. Right, so it's like whenever one or more creatures die, you mill a card and it gets the bloodstain counter. That doesn't trigger for each creature that dies necessarily, because if like 3 things die at the same time, I think it only gets 1 counter because it says 1 or more. But still, it's a removal spell on 2, which is good enough. And it's filling up your graveyard, which is useful, and eventually it regrows something from the graveyard. I think this card's actually fine. I think this is entirely playable. It's a little wordy, but I think all the stuff it does is good and is at a reasonable price. And I think it could go into a very wide variety of decks. Runebrand Juggler. So we got a 2/2 for 2, and when it ETBs, you can suspect up to 1 target creature you control. You don't have to. But for example, you could make this a 2/2 with Menace that can't block. Later, you can pay 5 mana, sacrifice a suspected creature, and target creature gets -5/-5 until end of turn. That's not very mana efficient. So, even though like a 2/2 with Menace for 2 is not an embarrassing creature by any means, and being able to turn into removal later is handy. And it is a big enough piece of removal it can kill like Sholdred and stuff. I just don't know if there's enough support for Suspected in Standard to want to play this card in your deck. It's okay, but I don't think it's okay enough. Deadly Complication. This card's neat. So 3 mana sorcery, choose 1 or both. Destroy target creature. It's always a good baseline floor for the card. Be better if it was an instant, obviously. You can either or also put a +1 counter on a suspected creature you control, and you may have it become no longer suspected. If you're wondering when you would ever do this in Constructed, there's the case of the Stashed Skeleton. That's a 2 mana play. So, you get out that on turn 2, you get out your 2/1 skeleton that has Menace and can't block. Turn 3, you can play Deadly Complication. Now you can kill an opponent's creature, unsuspect the skeleton, make it a 3/2, and that solves your case, which means on turn 4 you've got it available as a Demonic Tutor. That's not a terrible line. Right? You're adding to the board, you're removing stuff from the opponent's board, and then you end up with a Demonic Tutor and you still have 2 more mana left over on turn 4. That seems playable. So, I wouldn't say that a 3 mana sorcery speed removal spell is good enough on its own, but since we have that line available for the second mode, if you like Case of the Stashed Skeleton, this could maybe be good enough for standard play. And if you're on a budget, there's Runebrand Juggler, of course. This can be suspected on 2 and then unsuspected on 3, and you have a 3/3. So, I think this card could have a little bit of play. It's not the best or anything, but there's a couple of possibilities that I see for it. Judith, Carnage Connoisseur. We have a 3/4 for 5 mana. Legendary Human Shaman. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, choose one. The spell gains Death Touch and Lifelink. That's obviously for your red spells. Could be especially nasty with cards like In the Festivities that hit all the opponent's creatures for 1. Because then not only are you gaining a bunch of life, but all their creatures died because of Death Touch. That's nasty. You can also just make 2/2 red imps that when they die, they shock the opponent's face. And that's just a good solid mode as well. That's for your black spells, and then I guess maybe if you're in another color like blue, you know, most colors that are not red don't care about their spells getting Death Touch and Lifelink, but all your other colors in the deck can be producing imps, potentially at instant speed. Now, I don't know if this card is good enough for Standard. It could be. I think this is maybe for a control type of deck. You want to be controlling the board, keeping things cleaned up until you can get down Judith and have mana left open to protect her or at least use her ability. I think she could be good enough, and I think she can go into more than one kind of deck. You know, 5 is a lot of mana, but her effects are very good. So she could be good enough for Standard. Skip. Rakdos, Patron of Chaos. We have a 6/6 Flying Trampler for 6. He's big. At the beginning of your end step, target opponent may sacrifice 2 non-land, non-token permanents. If they don't, you draw 2 cards. So most of the time the opponent's probably going to let you draw 2 cards. It's a rare deck that puts a bunch of material on the board that's not tokens that they're willing to just let go of. Now I do have like a white mid-range control deck where I could see myself sacrificing 2 permanents. You know, like I played like a dog that drew me a card. I played a little guy who fetched me a plains. You know, I played an artifact that fetched me a plains, and now they play Rakdos, and I say, oh, I'll just sacrifice 2 things. I didn't need them that much. Most of the time you're going to draw 2 cards. And if the opponent can't kill Rakdos immediately, then you're going to do it at least once at your first in-step. That's nice. So does the card have the chops to get there and constructed? Again, I'll say maybe. You know, anything that's like a big threat that, you know, produces card advantage, affects the board in some way. Yeah. Yeah, even if they remove Rakdos, if they let you draw 2 cards first, they're down in the exchange. Maybe you can just get them back from the graveyard later. Assassin's Trophy. Reprint. Green and a black instant. Destroy target permanent an opponent controls. It can be a land. It can be a basic land. So, what I'd like to point out with Assassin's Trophy is if your opponent plays Ossification, target the land that the Ossification is on, and you will have destroyed the Ossification in the process by making them sacrifice it. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. So it's painful to give the opponent free lands. I will say that this could have an angle into a land destruction deck in Constructed, because this does blow up lands. And if you run the opponent out of basics, if they weren't running that many, then you could start just hitting all of their lands with all of your Assassin's trophies. And there are other ways, like Krinko's Buzz Crusher and stuff. I could see a new deck that pressures the opponent's lands using Assassin's Trophy and some other cards we have. The flexibility on this card's amazing. Ramping the mana is not great. Overall, the card's fine. It's playable. Good tool for the toolbox. Insidious Roots, this one is good. It is a build-around. I don't think it goes into a wide variety of decks. There's probably more than one way to build an Insidious Roots deck, but still, there aren't that many decks that are trying to do what this card's doing. So, it's just an uncommon. In that regard, it's not costing you much to craft it if you want to test it out. And yeah, I think it could have the chops to get there and construct it. Crawl Whipcracker. I think this card's actually pretty great. You got a 3/2 reach for 2 mana. That is a very relevant body on the battlefield. Good pressure, starting on 2. When it ETBs, you destroy a token an opponent controls. They won't always have a token for you, but sometimes they will. And sometimes you might be on the play and something like the Boros Tokens deck, you know, on their turn 1, they play out a thing and makes an artifact token. You just destroy it with a Crawl Whipcracker. And you've outsized their turn 1 play. And now they are definitely stalled on what they were trying to do with their game plan. There's a lot of board states where I feel like the Crawl Whipcracker is gonna have a target. It's gonna net you a little bit of value from its ETB. And a 3/2 reach is just a good, relevant body to have around. Flying trips me up all the time in Standard. I don't know if you run this card over some other 2-drops that Black and Green have available, but this is not bad at all. As far as like a budget option, I think this could be amazing for a budget deck. Skip. Urgent Necropsy? Not quite sure how you pronounce this one. 4 mana instant. Mythic rare. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you collect evidence X, where X is the total mana value of the permanents the spell targets. I have yet to try to cast this. I'm wondering if you have to do the math prior to casting it, or if you can just cast it, target the things, and then see if you have enough by the time you've done that. I'm curious. If you have to math it out ahead of time, some people might have trouble with that. So what it does is you destroy up to 1 target artifact, up to 1 target creature, up to 1 target enchantment, and up to 1 target planeswalker. This could be an amazingly powerful spell. You just need to have a significant amount of evidence in the graveyard. So I don't think you can just slot this into any deck, because if you haven't been filling the graveyard, this does nothing. You really need to have been filling up the graveyard to use this. So I don't know if I can recommend it for the toolbox. It's a wonderful tool to have for a deck that can turn it on, but I don't know how many decks can turn it on. Izoni, Center of the Web. She is a beating, especially in Limited. So, 6 mana, 5/4 Menace. Whenever this enters the battlefield or attacks, you may collect evidence 4. If you do, create 2 2/1 black and green spider creature tokens with Menace and Reach. those tokens having reach is a big deal for stabilizing the board. You're not just putting out 9 power and 6 toughness. You're also putting out 2 things that can block flying creatures. The other aspect of this card is it can be incredibly offensive because they all have menace. Izoni even protects you when she's attacking, right? Not because she has vigilance, but because she can produce yet more spiders. You do need cards in the graveyard, but by the time you hit 6 mana, that's not that hard to have accomplished in a game of Magic. Even cards that aren't, even decks that aren't trying very hard to fill up their graveyard might have evidence for Izoni. She's also got the ability sacrifice 4 tokens, surveil 2, draw 2 cards, gain 2 life. I don't think you worry about that part of this card unless you want to. You know, if you want to go all in on like making a bunch of blood tokens and stuff like that, just find some way to swarm a bunch of, you know, otherwise kind of useless or low impact tokens onto the board, and then powering Izoni's activated ability, that would be neat. You don't have to do that though. I think Izoni impacts the board enough on her own. Is she good enough for Constructed? I'm going to go out on a limb and say yes. Yes, I think so. I don't know that you want like to run 4 copies of Izoni, because it becomes less and less likely you have enough evidence in your graveyard. And I feel like a one-of copy of Izoni in most decks is going to be able to hit, and it's going to be a heck of a board presence when you get her out. So, yes, I think this is actually a good tool for your toolbox. Break out. Red, green, sorcery. Look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them. If it's got mana value 2 or less, you can put it right onto the battlefield and it gains haste. If you didn't put it out that way, then you put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom in a random order. So, you could use this as a sort of a creature tutor, but I think it really does its best work if you're finding a really aggressively costed 2-drop. Hajar is something that is in the colors. It is a 2-drop, and having a 3/3 with haste on turn 2 looks pretty doggone good. So I think this card is playable in Standard. A point against this card is if you happen to be up against Thalia. Her making this card 3 mana really hurts. That's not good. Aside from that, yeah, I think if you're in an aggressive red-green deck, then this is probably gonna find the hits for you that you need and give you a good early game aggressive start. Anzrag the Quake Mole. It's got power. It's got 8 power for 4 mana. The interesting thing is the opponent doesn't want to block it, because when they block it, you get another combat step. You untap your creatures. So even if they killed Anzrag, if you're attacking with other stuff, they might still be giving you the tools to win the game. And if they let Anzrag hit them, well, that's 8 damage. So, not terrible. This is definitely on the beatdown plan. You know, it doesn't protect itself, doesn't generate you card advantage. If you do happen to get to 7 mana, you can activate the ability where he must be blocked each combat. And if they can't kill him, if he's like indestructible or something, then that would be a big problem. So, the card's a bit of a meme, but there's some potential here. I won't tell you to run out and craft it, but I think you could probably build a reasonable deck with it. 10th Street Gossip. This is rock solid and limited. For constructed, probably not quite. 4/4 with Vigilance for 4 is not too embarrassing. It's not great. It also makes 2 mana, which you can only use to cast face-down spells or turn things face-up. And unfortunately, it seems like most of those cards are not going to be good enough for constructed. So, even though getting this out to accelerate your mana could be a reasonable play, if the cards you want to play with it are not strong enough for competitive environments, then that means this card's not going to be good enough either. We have some similar commentary for Yaris, Roar of the Old Gods. Now I will say it's a 4/4 for 4 that gives other creatures you control haste. That is not a bad line of text at all. He also says, whenever one or more face-down creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. Alright, so now they don't want your disguised creatures to get in, but whenever a face-down creature you control dies, you return it to the battlefield face down under its owner's control if it's a permanent card, and then it turns face up. Again, this card could be nasty with cloaking. You could turn some really powerful permanents and creatures face up that way. I guess if there was gonna be a deck using like morph creatures and such, maybe Yaris would be a way to do it. Outside of that deck, all he does is give your stuff haste, which is not nothing. But I don't think it's enough of a reason on its own to play the card. Probably doesn't get much of anywhere in constructed. Skip. World Soul's Rage. There have been some people trying to use this card. So, red, green, and X deals X damage to any target. Put up to X land cards from your hand and or graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. This could be pretty good with like the New Capenna common fetch lands. Those go straight to your graveyard, fetch out more lands for you, gain you a life. Pretty good way to set up the World Soul's Rage. You could reanimate some other lands too, you know, like Fields of Ruin and other stuff. Pick on the opponent a bit that way. So in a big ramp deck, you know, this can burn out like a creature or a planeswalker or something and ramp you some lands in the early to middle part of the game. Later in the game, this could just burn the opponent's face and kill them, because you're probably putting out a lot of mana in a World Soul's Rage deck. Skip. Lightning Helix. We've got a red and a white instant if you haven't seen the card before. Deal 3 damage to any target and you gain 3 life. Excellent. Great card. The only real question is, you know, what deck in Standard is going to make room to play this card. But it's got what it takes. Right, as long as this color combination wants this effect somewhere in Standard, this is some of the most efficiently costed removal and burn that you're going to see in the Standard format. Great tech against aggro. War Leader's Call. So we got a white, red, and 1 enchantment. Creatures you control get +1/+1. Alright, that's good. Glorious Anthem is not really good enough to see Standard play anymore. Alright, we've had other cards like that. There's one in, I think, the Brothers' War that does that, and you can also pay 6 to exile a creature once. That one sees no play. But this has another bit where it says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, this deals 1 damage to each opponent. So some builds of Boros tokens are using this card as a way to deal damage directly and to pump up their creatures. It is definitely good enough to see some play. And I think there is more than one way to try to build a deck with War Leader's Call. Boros tokens is the hot stuff at the moment, but Standard's going to keep changing and moving as the format alters and shifts and things come in and out. And there could be other War Leader's Call decks as well. It's a pretty good tool for the toolbox. Agris Kos, Spirit of Justice. I remember this guy from the old Ravnica novels. He's a spirit now. Spirit Detective. It's a 2/4 for 4. He's got double strike and vigilance, which is actually not bad abilities. Whenever he enters the battlefield or attacks, choose up to one target creature. If it's suspected, exile it. Otherwise, suspect it. And you don't have to use his ability. Interestingly, you can suspect your own creatures, so you could apply offensive pressure with Menace that way. You can force your opponent's creatures to be unable to block, so that's another aggressive use of the card. And then obviously if your opponent has some suspected stuff, you can just be exiling it. And the interesting bit is if you give him haste. Then he ETBs, suspects an opponent's creature, then he attacks and exiles the creature. So with haste, he's especially strong. Now all that being said, I'm not sure how many decks actually want him. He's a little weird. He is powerful, but he's a little weird. It's an interesting tool for an aggressive deck. So, if you want to do something a little more mid-range in Boros colors rather than the token strategy, Agris Kos could be an interesting choice for a more mid-rangey build. I'm not going to recommend him necessarily, though. Aurelia, the Law Above. 4/4 for 5. Flying, Vigilance, Haste. She's there to attack, she's there to block. Whenever a player attacks with 3 or more creatures, you draw a card. That can be you, that can be the opponent. Pretty nice. Whenever a player attacks with 5 or more creatures, Aurelia, the Law Above, deals 3 to each of your opponents and you gain 3 life. So she lightning helixes their face if you attack with 5 or more things. And if you're able to attack with 5 or more things the turn that you drop her, you probably should be winning the game. Yeah, Aurelia's for a certain kind of good, aggressive, mid-rangey kind of Boros build. You know, not for the low-to-the-ground tokens. They don't want to get to 5 mana, but if this kind of archetype ends up existing in Standard, Aurelia will probably be in it. At least a one of. I think she's strong enough, it's just that this particular deck archetype doesn't exist in this form right now. I also don't think she goes in a wide variety of decks. I think it's a pretty narrow calling that Aurelia's answering. Meddling Youths! And I'd have gotten away with it too. Anyway. 4/5 for 5. Has haste. Whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, investigate. Not as good as draw a card. This card is like okay in limited, but not actually amazing in limited. Probably doesn't do anything at all in constructed. Having haste, it could be like a budget option for a deck that like would want Aurelia but can't afford Aurelia yet. I could see running some Meddling Youths as like a budget option in that slot. but you'll replace it at some point. Sumala Sentry. This card is a beating in limited. 1/3 reach, 2 mana. Whenever a face-down permanent you control is turned face-up, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and a +1/+1 counter on Sumala Sentry. This would be a great enabler for a disguise deck, except I don't think there's going to be a disguise deck. So this probably won't get there. Tristani 3 Whispers. You have a 4/4 for 3. You need green and white in order to cast it, but it's a little bit flexible on whether you need 2 green or 2 white. Legendary Dryad. Pay a green and 1, target creature gains Death Touch until end of turn. It's useful. Green-white Hybrid. Target creature gains Vigilance until end of turn. Again, not bad. Can help you in a damage race to be able to block. And white and 2 colorless, target creature gains double strike until end of turn. So, if you're keeping score here, if you had 5 mana, then you could have a Death Touch double striker, which, a Death Touch first striker basically kills anything that it meets in combat because of the first strike and Death Touch. Double strike Death Touch is much the same. And if you had 6 total mana, you could also slap Vigilance in there. So this is useful. It's a 4/4 for 3. That's a solid rate. Passing out all these abilities to your creatures is good. So yeah, I think this is a playable card. Good tool for the toolbox. Buried in the Garden. So it's a little bit pricey for standard, but it also ramps you on mana. And it's kind of the interesting bit. Like Ossification, it enchants a land. Doesn't have to be a basic land, though. That would make it a bit more vulnerable if you put it on a non-basic. When it ETBs, you exile a non-land permanent you don't control until this leaves the battlefield. And whenever the enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional 1 mana of any color. So, this could be a piece of removal and ramp for a deck that wants to be ramping. It's a little odd. I don't love cards that can give the opponent their stuff back and give them their ETB triggers all over again. But I can see that it's a playable card. It's a little weird, but I think it's playable. Skip. Tulsimir, Midnight's Light. Amazing in limited. Probably just shy of constructed application. So it's a 3/2 lifelinker for 5 that also makes a legendary token. Voja Finstalker. 5/5 wolf with trample. And whenever a wolf you control attacks, if Tulsimir attacked this combat, so he's got to get in there, target creature an opponent controls blocks that wolf this combat if able. Mostly, works with Voja, but if you had other wolves in the deck, then they could sort of do a provoke sort of effect as well. Since this puts out 8 power and 7 toughness for 5 mana, this could see standard play. It could. There's a lot of other things clamoring for space at the 5 mana point, but it does put a lot of stuff on the battlefield. So I'm not going to say it's impossible that Tulsimir could find a deck. He really likes playing with wolves, so if you can run some other wolves in the deck, he gets better, but he's pretty good on his own. Relive the Past. this is kind of a narrow build around. So we got a 7 mana sorcery. Return up to 1 target artifact card, up to 1 target land card, up to 1 target non-aura enchantment card from your graveyard to the battlefield. They are 5/5 elemental creatures in addition to their other types. So the enchantment can't be an aura, I think because it turns it into a 5/5. So this could put out 15 power for you and reanimate 3 things from your graveyard. That would certainly be good enough. But you have to build a deck where you've gotten artifacts, lands, and enchantments into your graveyard in order to cast this sorcery. That's a lot of card types in case you're keeping count. So finding the right mix of cards to put in the deck in order to fully realize Relive the Past is a little difficult. Also, it's a 7 mana sorcery, so you've got to kind of ramp up to it or trick it out somehow. If you can get the full value off of this card, then I'm sure you're doing good stuff at that point. You know, if you fill up the graveyard, ramp to 7, and do this, then getting 15 power of stuff out is probably going to stabilize the board for you, and maybe you're on your way to winning the game. Could be getting some nasty ETB triggers from the stuff you reanimated as well. Like a Portal to Phyrexia and some other nonsense. But I don't think this goes in a wide variety of decks. I think if you want to relive the past, you got to build a Relive the Past deck. So I don't consider this a toolbox card. Evidence Examiner. You got a 2/2 for 2, green-blue. Merfolk Detective. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may collect evidence 4. Whenever you collect evidence, investigate. So, if there was a collect evidence deck in Standard, right, like you were running the 3/3 for 4 in blue that makes a Thopter whenever you collect evidence, then you could start to run some cards like this one that have these triggers whenever you collect evidence. Right, then you'd make a Clue and a Thopter, and then maybe there's some other stuff you could put into a collect evidence deck, but being able to mill yourself enough that you're reliably triggering those cards all the time feels a little difficult. I don't know if there's enough support and enough cards that refer to collect evidence to make it worth your time. Now this is just an uncommon, so if you want to try to see if you can build that deck, you could go ahead, but that might be a rabbit hole that burns up some wild cards for you and ends up being disappointing. Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy. So this is a good enough card just based on its sorcery adventure, Tail the Suspect. You investigate and you may play an additional land this turn. Playing an additional land is good enough. You need a pretty high land count, but you can do it. You can play this card, you can get value off of it for sure. Then you can get a 3/4 Flying Vigilance, and whenever he attacks, you destroy up to 1 target artifact, and if you controlled it, you draw a card. So he can crack your Clue for free, or he can be blowing up the opponent's artifacts. It's a neat card. It's good enough to see play. I'm not quite sure what Simic is doing at the moment in Standard, but if you like the look of this, you want to run a high land count and ramp that way, then this card is going to be good for your deck. I think there's more than one way to try to build it. These are reasonably flexible tools, so yeah, I think he's pretty good. Vanifar, Evolved Enigma. This actually kind of reminds me of the 5 mana Glissa a little bit, that no one plays. Who can like make incubate tokens or flip your incubate tokens, or Phyrexians you control get like lifelink and death touch until end of turn. Now this one's only 4 mana. but you don't get the creatures for free exactly because you have to spin a card. You have to cloak a card from your hand. And that is costing you a resource. You could be cloaking cards you didn't have a good use for, like extra lands and stuff, but still, it costs you something. She does it at the beginning of combat, so as long as she survives to combat, you get to do this. At which point you've put out 5 power and 6 toughness for 4 mana, which is good. The other thing she can do is put a +1/+1 counter on each colorless creature you control. And that almost feels like you should build a deck for her, where you get out artifact creatures, or those, like Phyrexian Mites would count, or the little colorless spirits from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, you remember those? And obviously, face-down things are colorless. That's her intended synergy, but she works well with like artifact tokens and colorless tokens as well. So I think this card could be good enough. I can't swear to you that's going to be strong enough to see play. There are so many cards among the Sultai colors that aren't seeing play right now that look so good. Maybe Vannifar is just another one, but I think you could run this card and get value from this card even if no one else is running her. And this might actually be one of the ways to try to do something with a disguise deck, because she's just cloaking stuff for you. Skip. Doppelgang. You need to get to 8. You could cast it for 5 if you were desperate, and that would be maybe okay depending on what you copy. You know, like if the opponent has a Titan of Industry or something, you just say, well, I'm stuck on 5, I'll Doppelgang it. That's not bad. But really you want to get to 8 or 11 or more. At that point, Doppelgang becomes kind of ridiculous and stupid. And it can start becoming more than the sum of its parts once you get up into those mana ranges. You know, like if you have 14 mana when you play Doppelgang, then you can target 4 things and make 4 copies of each of those 4 things. And if you targeted lands, then you, for 14 mana, you put out 16 lands at that point that never existed before. And that would make your next Doppelgang impressive, shall we say. You probably could just win the game if you have Doppelgang with, 11 or 14 mana. But it could also set up an even bigger Doppelgang if that's the kind of player that you are. I think this can be good enough. There are lots of ways to ramp in Standard, and this might actually be the thing that Simic wants to do, that wants to ramp like mad to get up to, is a Doppelgang. Repulsive Mutation. This one feels like a rare. There's a couple of uncommons in the set that feel more like a rare than an uncommon. This is one of them. So, green, blue, and X instant. You can put X +1/+1 counters on a creature you control, then counter up to 1 target spell, unless its controller pays mana equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. It's a pump spell and a counter spell at the same time. If you counter a spell with this thing, it's a blowout. Right? Because if you got to grow your creature at the same time you countered their spell, that is such a ridiculously strong tempo play. I think this card's absolutely good enough to see play for Standard. I don't know what deck it goes into, but it's a good tool for the toolbox, and it's only an uncommon for some reason. Voja, Jaws of the Conclave. For some reason, this is a 3-color card in Ravnica. So, I get a 5/5 for 5. Vigilance, Trample, and Ward 3. Not bad. Whenever this attacks, put X +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, where X is the number of elves you control. So if you got some elves, this can do an alpha strike swing and probably win the game. If X is much more than 1, you're probably just winning the game. You need some elves to do that. You draw a card for each wolf you control. That will be at least 1 because Voja is a wolf. And, you could try to go with an elves and wolves theme here. Draw extra cards, but really just the pump effect. Just pumping the squad, win the game. I think that's really the way you try to play Voja. This card is probably strong enough if you find enough good elves and wolves, but it's a narrow card that doesn't have many kinds of different ways to build the deck. So it's not really a toolbox card. I've actually covered all of these cards in the monocolored sections, but I am going to touch on them again here. So I don't think you run push-pull in a deck unless you want the pull. If you want to reanimate potentially 2 creature cards from a graveyard, gain haste, sack at the end of turn. If you want the pull side of the card, then push comes along for the ride. It's not that efficient, but it's a 2-mana removal spell, and you get it attached to your reanimation spell. As long as you want the pull, then yeah, this card's good enough, and this is a great tool to have in the toolbox. Hustle and Bustle. This feels like one of the weaker cards of the cycle to me. It's not useless. Hustle can, play tricks with the opponent, force them into a bad attack or block. It's not that strong, but as long as you have some creatures, you can play games with the opponent. Bustle is, a way to try to overrun Alpha Strike the opponent. The thing about turning a creature face up may or may not matter. +2/+2 and Trample is not bad, but 6 is a lot of mana. Hopefully it's enough by that mana cost to win you the game. If it doesn't, you're in trouble. I'm not that impressed with Hustle and Bustle. Cease and Desist. So Desist is good. It is a good effect. I think it does come up quite a bit in Standard. Probably a sideboard card for best of 3. Could be a few decks that would play it main deck, but I don't think you'd run many copies if you do. You get the Cease side early on for some graveyard hate. Drawing a card can help you, find your land drops, all of that. Smooths out the game a little. As long as you also want the Desist in the deck. It's not amazing, but it could be a nasty trick. And there are some decks like Domain, where blowing up all of their artifacts and enchantments could be pretty devastating. Getting rid of all their ossifications and, exile enchantments could give you a bunch of stuff back with all of its ETB triggers. Fuss and Bother, I'm not sure what deck wants this exactly. Bother is a lot of mana. If you've been having trouble with board sweepers and such, then Bother is a way to resupply you with an aggressive board. But 6 is a lot of mana. Fuss is not a terrible, combat trick. A way to try to pump the squad, win the game. They still have the buff the next turn as long as they're still around. But there are other ways to do what Fuss is doing that pump the squad for more power. So I'm not sure that this card does much. Flotsam and Jetsam. The Mill 3 Investigate. There are lots of other cards to mill yourself in Standard. It'd be okay. but it's not that impressive. And Jetsam actually targets the opponent, right? It makes the opponent mill cards, and you get to cast a spell from their graveyard without paying its mana cost. That feels like it could be good enough as a sideboard option, where if you're up against like a Reanimator deck or a Go Big Ramp deck, then you could Jetsam, dig around in their graveyard, and find some giant thing to cast for free. But I don't know that you play it main deck, so I'm not too sure about this card. Leyline of the Guild Pact. This would be a narrow card in Standard. It turns on the colorless case. So if you were making that case deck, then you could use the Leyline. It also turns on Domain. So if you're making a Domain deck from like Dominaria United, then this could turn on all of your stuff immediately at max power. Other than those examples, I'm not sure what other deck needs this, because the mana bases in Standard are good enough to run 5 colors if you want to. So, I only have 2 examples for this card off the top of my head for Standard. I don't know if either of them are good enough reason to play with the card. It is a tool that you can put into any deck and potentially get out for free. I just don't know what it's doing for you. So, I don't recommend crafting it at this point. Finally, we got Niv Mizzet Guild Pact. So he's a 6/6 for 5, flying. He has hexproof from Multicolored, which can let him dodge a fair bit of removal. Whenever he deals combat damage to a player, he deals X damage to any target, you draw X cards, you gain X life, where X is the number of different color pairs among permanents you control that are exactly 2 colors. Exactly 2 colors means that this is not a combo with the Leyline. This makes your permanents every color. So they're not exactly 2 colors, they're 5 colors. If there is a Niv Mizzet deck in Standard, it's probably going to be about exactly 1 deck. There's certainly ways to get 2-color permanents out, even token 2-color permanents, right? Like the White-Blue Detective is a 2-color permanent. There are ways to do it. So you can make a 5-color deck, have Niv Mizzet as your win condition, just try to keep him protected. He protects himself a little bit, so that's helpful. But it doesn't go in a wide variety of decks, so I don't recommend crafting it. And Niv brings us to the end of Multicolored. So, let me see what I want to craft here. I'm going to give some love to Teysa here. Death Touchers are always pretty handy. And she does have a good amount of value on the card, even though you have to find ways to turn it on. I think that Teysa could definitely find some homes in decks that I build. World Soul's Rage. I like messing with land and messing with the graveyard. So this looks like fun to me. I look forward to making a new graveyard lands deck, trying out World Soul's Rage. So I'm going to go ahead and craft a copy here. War Leader's Call seems like an exceptionally pushed card. I am going to go ahead and craft a copy. I believe there will be other decks, not just Boros tokens, that come along sometime in the future, and I'll be happy to have some number of this in my collection to build those decks with. I love ramp decks, so Doppelgang seems like my speed. I also enjoy copying things. So, just the completely nutty potential of this card. Like once you're getting to 8 and 11 and beyond, it appeals to me, tickles my fancy. I just look forward to finding a way to ramp up to that mana and completely blowing out the opponent at that point. I'm going to use one of my mythics on Trostani, 3 Whispers. This is just a really strong creature. Just good rate, good body, good effects. Having one copy of a legend like this for a deck in these colors, you get access to all of these neat abilities. And a 4/4 for 3. So I like it. Sometimes I'm looking for anti-aggro tech when I'm building a deck, because it occurs to me that I need to stay alive somehow. Tomek seems like a great card against aggressive players. So, even though I think it's dumb that it says affinity for planeswalkers, this still seems like a useful card to me all the way around, so I'm going to go ahead and use a mythic to craft a copy here. Alright, let's do this thing. So, that finishes out the Deckbuilding Toolbox series. Some things you can expect from me going forward: I will be brewing up some new decks. I may also have a video where I offer some commentary on my thoughts on Murders at Karlov Manor as a set. You know, its design, its aesthetic, its story, all of that. So stay tuned for those videos coming up on the channel. And yeah, until then, like, subscribe, check out all my other videos, and never stop honing your critical thinking and empathy.